The career of Betty Boop was much like Betty herself, short, sweet, and memorable. Introduced as a one-off side character before embarking on a meteoric rise towards briefly becoming the biggest cartoon character in the world, appearing in over 100 cartoons in only 9 years before her star burned out seemingly overnight. Betty enjoyed a brief comeback in the 1980s before disappearing completely, but not without leaving behind an animated legacy. Immortalized as a symbol of old Hollywood glitz and glamour, a trailblazing feminist icon, and forever remembered as the queen of the animated screen. In January 2026, several Betty Boop cartoons entered the public domain, and so now seems like a good time to take a look back at her development and history, the rise and fall and legacy of the one and only Betty Boop. Betty Boop is a caricature of a jazz-age flapper, a subculture of young Western women prominent after the First World War and throughout the 1920s, who wore short skirts, bobbed their hair, listened to jazz, and flaunted their disdain for prevailing codes of decent behavior. Flappers were seen as brash for wearing excessive makeup, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes in public, driving automobiles, and otherwise flouting social and sexual norms. Betty Boop was created by American animator Grim Natwick for Fleischer Studios, under the direction of studio head Max Fleischer. Walt Disney considered Grim Natwick to be an expert on animating women, and in 1934, Natwick would leave Fleischer Studios to work at Walt Disney Animation, eventually becoming a lead animator on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and was the person chiefly responsible for animating the Snow White character. Betty Boop combines the childish with the sophisticated, her age ranging from late teens to early 20s, her appearance consisting of a large round baby face with big eyes and a nose like a button, and her small body framed in a careful coiffure. In addition, Betty is a New Yorker and is notable for her spit curls, baby talk, and scat singing. Betty was never expected to be a star, initially introduced by Fleischer as a one-off love interest for their main star, Bimbo. In 1929, Fleischer Studios released Talkatoons, a series of 42 black and white theatrical sound cartoons, and introduced a new character, an anthropomorphic dog named Bimbo, who became the protagonist of the Talkatoon series and Fleischer Studios' biggest cartoon star, positioned as a rival to Disney's Mickey Mouse. Bimbo made his first appearance in Hot Dog, the fourth cartoon in the Talkatoon series, released on March 29, 1930. On August 9th that same year, Fleischer released the seventh Talkatoon cartoon, Dizzy Dishes, which featured Bimbo as a waiter at a busy restaurant where he encounters and falls in love with the local cabaret singer, an early prototype of Betty Boop, here appearing as an unnamed anthropomorphic French poodle. While various celebrities and entertainers have been credited as being the inspiration for Betty Boop, Max Fleischer himself requested a caricature of American actress and singer Helen Kane. In Dizzy Dishes, the character performs a rendition of the song I Have to Have You from the 1929 film Pointed Heels, even incorporating her emerging boop-boop-a-doop catchphrase during the performance. The song was originally sung in the film by Helen Kane, who years later sued Fleischer Studios, claiming they had stolen her Boop Boop a Doop line and had thereby caused Kane's career to wane as Betty's star rose. When the case came to trial, other performers testified that they had used Boop Boop a Doop and similar phrasings prior to Helen Kane, and the singer lost her case. In Dizzy Dishes, the character is voiced by Margie Hines, who would voice Betty Boop until 1932, and again from 1938 until 1939, and later voiced Olive Oyl and Sweet Pea in the Popeye the Sailor cartoons. Betty would be voiced by various voice actresses over the years, but would soon be voiced exclusively by Mae Questel, who provided the voice of Betty Boop in more than 80 animated shorts from 1931 until 1938, and who, like Margie Hines before her, would also voice Olive Oyl in later years. The Betty Boop prototype character would appear in the very next Talkatoons cartoon, Barnacle Bill, and this time given a name, Nancy Lee, retaining some of the canine physical characteristics that she had in Dizzy Dishes, and was once again a secondary character, the love interest of the main star, Bimbo. Over the next year, she would continue to transform into a completely human female character and eventually given a name. At first, simply Betty in the 1931 short Silly Sandals, and then later that year given her full name, Betty Boop, as seen in the title card of the cartoon Minding the Baby. By the release of Any Rags on January 2nd, 1932, Betty Boop had become established as a fully human character. Her floppy poodle ears became hoop earrings, her black poodle nose became a feminine button nose, and the world's first truly female cartoon star was fully formed. There had, of course, been female cartoon characters before Betty Boop, but her predecessors were more or less one-dimensional stock characters who were either clones of their male co-stars or played second fiddle to them. Betty Boop was popular with adult audiences, and the cartoons, while both humorous and surreal, contain many sexual and psychological elements, which had become hallmarks of Fleischer Studios by that time. One of the most famous cartoons during the Talkatoons era was Minnie the Moocher, released in early 1932, and which featured the famous jazz singer Cab Calloway and his orchestra, singing the namesake hit song. The short is considered to be one of the most significant cartoons in the history of animation, known for reinventing the rotoscope process, as well as playing an important part in developing the character and building the popularity of Betty Boop. Minnie the Moocher defined Betty's character as a teenager of a modern era, at odds with the old world ways of her strict parents. And after a disagreement with them, Betty runs away from home with her boyfriend Bimbo. The Film Daily wrote at the time of Minnie the Moocher's release that Betty Boop seemed to be getting more sexy and alluring each time. And by this time it was clear that Betty Boop was unique among female cartoon characters, as she represented a sexual woman. Other female cartoon characters of the same period, such as Minnie Mouse, displayed their underwear or bloomers regularly, but in the style of childish or comical characters, not a fully defined woman's form. Betty Boop wore short dresses, high heels, a visible garter, scandalous in the 1930s, and her breasts were highlighted with a low, contoured bodice that showed cleavage. By 1932, Betty Boop had become established as a symbol of the Depression era, a reminder of the more carefree days of jazz-age flappers, and even today is regarded as the first and one of the best-known sex symbols on the animated screen. By 1932, Betty Boop was a global icon and arguably the biggest cartoon star in the world, even appearing in Shunkodo, a Japanese comic strip in 1933. Having outgrown the entire Talkatoon series, in August 1932, Betty was given her own series of cartoons named after her, beginning with Stopping the Show, and 89 cartoons were produced under her name. Many Betty Boop cartoons are musical numbers, often portraying particular songs, in a way a precursor to music videos introduced decades later. With Betty's strong connection to the jazz movement, many notable jazz musicians appeared in her cartoons, including Cab Calloway, as well as Don Redman and even Louis Armstrong, who would appear in live-action sequences at the beginning of the cartoon and then reappear during the animated segments as either caricatures or cameos as themselves. These cartoons would help promote particularly the Harlem jazz culture and set a precedent for having major celebrities appear as themselves in animated cartoons. In July 1933, a Betty Boop cartoon would serve as a vehicle to introduce a brand new Fleischer cartoon character, Popeye the Sailor, a short simply named Popeye the Sailor, in which Betty only makes a brief cameo. This cartoon would mark a transition in the hierarchy at Fleischer Studios, as Popeye would go on to become the biggest star at Fleischer Studios, while Betty's star would soon begin to wane. In 1934, Betty appeared in the first color classic cartoon, Poor Cinderella, Fleischer's first color cartoon and Betty's only theatrical color appearance, where she was depicted with red hair as opposed to her typical black hair. Betty Boop enjoyed her heyday during her first 3 years, but the good times wouldn't last forever. Complaints were growing of too much smut in cartoons, and the content of Betty Boop's films put her in conflict with both the National Legion of Decency and the Production Code of 1934, also known as the Hays Code, which imposed guidelines and restrictions on the motion picture industry, which included censoring animation, greatly affecting the Betty Boop cartoons. No longer a carefree flapper from the date the code went into effect on July 1st, 1934, Betty became a spinster housewife or a career girl who wore a fuller dress or skirt, and the curls in her hair gradually decreased in number. She also eventually stopped wearing her gold bracelets and hoop earrings, and she became more mature and wiser in personality compared to her earlier years. Further complaints included the suggestive introduction that had started the cartoons, in which Betty Boop's winks and shaking hips were deemed suggestive of immorality and were also removed. The subsequent cartoons were a lot more tame because of these restrictions and became primarily aimed at a younger audience, which diminished her popularity with her original target audience of adults. Since Betty was largely a musical novelty character, the animators attempted to keep her cartoons interesting by pairing her with popular comic strip characters such as Henry, the Little King, and Little Jimmy, and also introduced other characters like a new human boyfriend named Freddy, a puppy named Pudgy, even the eccentric inventor Grampy, but these shakeups backfired. The lessening of Betty's role in the cartoons in favor of her co-stars only contributed to Betty's decline in popularity towards the end of the 1930s, which was further exacerbated by the success of Fleischer's biggest star, Popeye. A similar problem experienced during the same period with Walt Disney's Mickey Mouse, who was becoming eclipsed by the popularity of his co-stars, Donald Duck, Goofy, and Pluto, forcing Disney to revamp Mickey. When the flapper jazz era that Betty represented had been replaced by the big bands of the swing era, Fleischer Studios made an attempt to develop a replacement character in this style, as seen in a handful of cartoons towards the end of her run, and to bring Betty into the swing era, including her final cartoon appearance, Rhythm on the Reservation, but it was not a success. The Betty Boop cartoon series officially ended with the release of Yip Yip Yippee, released on 11th of August 1939, the final entry of the Betty Boop series. Betty had been dropped before the series ended and was nowhere to be seen in the final Betty Boop cartoon. Betty would reappear in the early 1970s in a commercial for American cleaning company 409, singing the company's theme song. Before her first official animated appearance after 46 years, a television special entitled The Romance of Betty Boop, airing on March 20th, 1985, and which was produced by Lee Mendelsohn and Bill Melendez, the same creative team behind the Peanuts specials. Bill Melendez directed the special, set in New York in the year 1939, the year Betty's cartoon series ended. Selling shoes by day and performing at Club Bubbles by night, Betty Boop is a popular figure in her neighborhood. Betty's old boyfriend Freddy reappears as a well-meaning local man whose advances Betty ignores and instead sets her eyes on moving up in society by marrying a millionaire playboy, Walder Van Lavish, all the while pursued by local gangster Johnny Throat. Betty Boop was voiced by Desiree Goyette, who had appeared as Betty Boop in person the year before in a touring act called Betty Boop on the Road, and would later voice a Betty Boop spoof, Googie Goop, in the 1996 Animaniacs episode The Girl with the Googly Goop, a parody of Betty Boop cartoons and Fleischer animation in general. Mae Questel reportedly gave Desiree Goyette her blessing as the new voice of Betty Boop, but did voice the iconic character herself one more time in Betty's cameo appearance in the cartoon all-star feature film Who Framed Roger Rabbit. In the ink and paint nightclub scene in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Detective Eddie Valiant encounters Betty Boop, where she is working as a waitress after being out of work since cartoons turned to color, but assures Eddie that she still got it and delivers her signature line.
Boop, boop, be-doo.
Yeah, you still got it.
This was followed by another television special, Betty Boop's Hollywood Mystery, produced by King Features Entertainment and released on June 25th, 1989. The story is also set in the 1930s, and the special itself is a homage to Fleischer Studios during the same period, mimicking the studio's famous rubber hose style of animation, and Betty Boop's Hollywood mystery is filled with other Fleischer characters from the 1930s. Betty Boop is joined by her original Fleischer co-stars, Coco the Clown and Bimbo, the latter of which appearing for the first time in color. The trio are fired from their restaurant jobs and become amateur detectives in search of a diamond necklace as they take on the underbelly of Hollywood and its moguls, mansions and mysteries in a neo-noir spoof. Various celebrities were considered for the role of Betty Boop, including Cyndi Lauper and also Mae Questel, who was busy at the time filming Woody Allen's New York Stories, and so director George Evelyn instead cast his secretary, Melissa Fahn, in her first voice acting role, and who went on to have a long and prolific career in voice acting, which continues until the present day. In between these specials, Betty would appear in more commercials, first in 1986 in a commercial for Milk, in 1988 appearing in 2 commercials for Hershey's, one of the all-time greats, chocolate bar, and in the 21st century an animated Betty Boop has appeared in commercials for Garnier, LG Electronics, as well as a string of commercials for Day and Night Energy, advertising their energy supplements for women. In 2012, Betty Boop became the spokesperson for French cosmetics company Lancome and their mascara products, appearing alongside fashion model Daria Verboe in a big-budget short-form commercial presenting one of Lancome's newest makeup set, a commercial that paid homage to the old Hollywood glamour of Betty Boop. In 2017, Betty appeared with fashion designer Zach Posen, a judge on Project Runway, in an animated promotional short produced by King Feature Syndicate, Fleischer Studios, and Pantown to produce 2 of Posen's new dresses inspired by Betty Boop herself. Both dresses, as well as a lipstick produced by MAC Cosmetics, use a particular shade of red created by Pantown named Betty Boop Red. And in 2022, Betty Boop was reanimated once again when Fleischer Studios partnered with footwear manufacturer Doc Martens to produce an animated commercial featuring Betty to promote the company's new range of footwear inspired by Betty Boop and paying homage to her legacy. Outside of animation, a Betty Boop comic strip was distributed by King Feature Syndicate from 1934 until 1937, and almost 50 years later, Betty appeared alongside Felix the Cat in a fresh newspaper comic strip entitled Betty Boop and Felix from 1984 to 1988. Betty was featured in Betty Boop's Big Break, a 52-page graphic novel released by First Comics in 1990, and in 2016, Dynamite Entertainment published 4 issues in their new Betty Boop comics. In 2007, Betty Boop was eventually given her own video game, Betty Boop's Double Shift, developed and published by DSi Games and released on the Nintendo DS. And in 2023, Betty Boop was the star of a Broadway musical called Boop the Musical, starring Jasmine Amy Rogers as Betty, who longs for a break from her black and white cartoon world and time travels to present-day New York City. Betty Boop remains one of the most recognizable cartoon characters in the world, and the first recurring fully human female character in theatrical cartoon shorts. After appearing in over 100 cartoons from 1930 until 1939, it's crazy that her next appearance came more than 45 years later. And aside from a handful of cameos in commercials in recent years, it's hard to believe that her last official animated appearance came in Betty Boop's Hollywood Mystery more than 35 years ago. How do you feel about a Betty Boop comeback? Let us know in the comments how you would feel about a modern-day Betty Boop revival, if an animated reboot would be a good idea, or if Betty Boop was more of a product of her time and made more sense in the 1930s. Essential Betty Boop cartoons include Minnie the Moocher, Snow White, Poor Cinderella, and Old Man of the Mountain. But be sure to let us know in the comments which other Betty Boop cartoons you particularly recommend. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. Please like this video if you learned something today, and be sure to subscribe if you enjoy content like this. And why don't you let me know in the comments what other iconic cartoon characters you would like me to cover in the near future. I'll be back again soon, so until then, stay safe and stay tuned for more cartoon history.